My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon, and I am the Director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. Before we begin today's conversation, I want to acknowledge that we are coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. And this is the traditional land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Métis. Now, this is a week where we celebrate the cooperative sector. And while we take this opportunity to kind of unite, reflect, celebrate, and promote the cooperative movement here and all over the world, it's also an important opportunity to remind ourselves that as individuals and organizations in the cooperative sector, we have a responsibility to work towards truth and reconciliation in our country. This year, the theme of Co-op Week is Cooperation in the World of Tomorrow. As the Executive Director of Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada stated, Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada is the kind of organization that represents cooperatives all over the country at the federal level largely. The individual who heads that organization said, the future of cooperation lies in building relationships within our communities. And from our perspective, there's no relationship more important in Canada than the relationship with our Indigenous friends. So in terms of the process of today's conversation, we're going to have our first ever graduate student research showcase. And the idea here is for you to kind of get some of the energy and the excitement from people who are actively engaged in studying cooperatives and kind of hear what they have to say. Each of our panelists, so we have 3 panelists, they're each going to have about 10 to 12 minutes to kind of share where their thinking is at. And then we're going to have a general question and answer period. And that's where we want to hear from you. We want your questions and dialogue. This is pretty loosey-goosey, informal affair. So don't feel shy to jump in. If anyone's experiencing technical difficulties along the way, please send a text or message, to Stan Yu. And Stan, can you wave to people? I'm assuming you're waving.
Hello.
Stan. Great, thank you. We're going to be recording this session. You probably noticed that already, and the link will be shared with everyone who registered for the event. And then we'll email this all back to you if you want to watch this before going to bed some night, something. So I'm going to introduce my panelists, starting with Candice Minott. Minott. I'm not sure how to say your last name, Candice. What is the proper?
Minott, Professor.
Thank you, Candice Minott. Candice is currently a master's student in the Masters of Public Administration program here at the Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. Before attending the University of Saskatchewan, she was a senior manager, brand management and advertising for the Jamaican National Group, or JN Group, in Kingston, Jamaica. The JN Group started as a building society. It's a mutual organization. It's a type of co-op, if you want to think of it that way. And it was founded in 1874, and it's grown into one of Jamaica's top 3 financial conglomerates. She has more than 20 years of sales, brand, and marketing management experience in the banking, petroleum, and fast-moving consumer goods industries. Her areas of interest as it relates to public policy includes financial literacy, financial inclusion, and poverty alleviation. So Candice is going to go first. Then I'm going to briefly introduce right now out the gate our other 2 speakers. Starting next with Kevin Harding. Kevin is going to be our second speaker, and Kevin is a PhD candidate here at the Policy School, and his academic background is in political science, public policy, and critical political economy. Kevin also brings a real wealth of experience in public policy roles in nonprofit and government organizations. In fact, we were just talking about the British Columbia's review of cooperative legislation, and Kevin has a bit of an inside track on that. Kevin's research is really aimed at understanding this intersection of public policy and cooperatives, something that's near and dear to my heart, and I know Bill's heart as well. And that's about, really understanding how do policymakers and cooperative leaders, understand cooperatives and how they view cooperatives as potential tools for potential public policy. Last but not least, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Bill Omakin. Bill is actually here at the University of Saskatchewan this week. Normally he resides in Madison, Wisconsin. Like Kevin, he is a PhD dissertation candidate here at the Policy School. He's a member of the Law Society of Alberta and partner in Community and Cooperative Council based in Calgary, one of the few, if not the only, law firms devoted exclusively to cooperatives. Bill Omakin is also a University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School College of Agriculture and Life Sciences researcher, that's a mouthful, Bill, in food systems, security, and preparedness. And he serves on the boards of several cooperatives, including the education insurance arm of the $440 billion American Farm Credit System, which is structured around cooperatives. So if you don't know much about cooperatives, Bill's your guy, especially if it's in the US context. Boy, he can tell a mean story. Bill will be presenting his research on the opportunities and challenges of big ag data. And so that's data collected by farmers and the opportunities of forming a producer-owned data cooperative so that the value of data sits with the farmer, not with some distant entity owned somewhere else. So that's how we're going to proceed. We're going to start with Candice, then Kevin, and then Bill. So Candice, over to you. The microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this opportunity. And a big thank you also to Stan Yu for his support. It is such an honor to be presenting today from a Jamaican perspective. And I'd love to just acknowledge some of my colleagues in Jamaica who they have joined us today. St. Beverly Tomlinson, she is the Assistant General Manager at First Heritage Cooperative Credit Union, and also Davell Thompson and Suzanne Hendricks from the Jamaica National Group. They're senior members of the team there. So thank you again for this opportunity. So I'm going to speak about neutrals in Jamaica. And in keeping with the theme, Co-op Week is truly a worldwide event. And in Jamaica, we have a rich history of cooperatives, credit unions, and building societies. So the topics I'm going to discuss today, I'm going to give you just a little scan of the Jamaican financial industry. The Jamaica National Group, that's the entity where I've had a majority of my experience with neutrals. It's a dynamic company, and I'm excited for you all to learn about their story and just some of the key learnings and insights that I would have gleaned through my experience there. So Jamaica is an island country in the Caribbean, in the West Indies. And we are known internationally, of course, for our tourism product. If you know Bob Marley, Usain Bolt, these are Jamaicans. Name them, we are big in the international arena. You know, we have a saying locally, you know, we little but we talawa, which means that we are proud people. We're strong people, and we're not constrained by the size of the island. So the island itself is about the size of Connecticut, with a population of around about 2.7. We're doing a census currently, and we believe that that may come out at about 2.9 million people. Employment is on the high side, and also inflation. And we are assiduously working to address some of those economic issues. The current government, they have a few strategies in place to counteract that. As it relates to cooperatives and our history of cooperatives, in the early 40s, what happened is that various communities in Jamaica used cooperatives and societies as a means to combat poverty and other social issues. And in 1950, the government decided to regulate cooperatives under the Cooperatives Act and establish the Department of Cooperatives and Friendly Societies. And this resides within the Ministry of Investment, Industry and Commerce. So currently, this entity oversees more than 688 entities. This includes cooperative societies, industrial and provident societies, and also regular societies. So as you can see, despite the size of the island, we do have an extensive history with cooperatives. What we can say currently as it relates to the financial industry, there are three major players in the commercial banking space. National Commercial Bank, they are the top financial institution. Scotiabank also has a very strong presence in Jamaica. They are number two. Genbank, which is a subsidiary of the Jamaica National Group, is in third place. And these three round out the majority or the gamut of the industry. However, not understated, the entire credit union movement does have 7.78%. And also building societies would factor in the industry as well. And with the others rounding out about 24.43%. Typically, what we found in the market is that overall, as of June, the banking sector has witnessed some growth, about 4.46%. And as at June 30th, 2022, the total number of loans in the banking sector was valued at 1.2 trillion Jamaican dollars, with total assets about 2.4 trillion Jamaican. That's about 22 billion Canadian dollars. So quite a sizable industry. In terms of some of the issues that the financial industry is facing at this time, just like other institutions worldwide, we have come under some cybersecurity threats. The Jamaica National Group has experienced some cybersecurity threats. And with the onset of the pandemic, all financial institutions have had to increase their investment in technology and are looking at a very competitive space. So all institutions are positioning for growth. In terms of economic instability, we see that there is still continued depreciation of the Jamaican dollar, rising interest rates, and there has been some loss of employment locally with the pandemic. So we have a lot of sectors that are still just emerging out of the post-pandemic era. In terms of our members, what we found is that they're becoming more sophisticated, their preferences are changing. They've had to change their behavior due to the pandemic, and all the financial institutions as well have had to be a little bit more nimble in how we treat with our members. They're price sensitive, they're demanding more from financial institutions. And from a regulatory point of view, there are a number of new regulations that are in process. The Microcredit Act, typically microfinance institutions were not regulated by the Bank of Jamaica. However, they're in the process now of going through that sandbox with the BOJ. All microfinancial institutions will be regulated. Also, the Banking Services Act will have to be amended to really accommodate this. Cooperatives as well will now come under the Banking Services Act. They are also in the sandbox getting ready for this new regulation. And also there have been some amendments to the Pension Act. And a lot of institutions have made some adjustments, moving their pension arm out of the commercial banking sector and focusing it within their insurance arms. As it relates to the Jamaica National Group, I'm very proud to share about this institution with you all. First of all, I just want to share with you that the Jamaica National Group was founded on the principle of mutuality. In 1874, it was established as a means of improving members' life outcomes and helping them to achieve their goals. Now, just putting it into context, even though the journey of the Jamaica National Group started 148 years ago, one of the main thrusts was to extend property ownership after the abolition of slavery. Now, Jamaica gained independence in August 6, 1962, and by that time, this institution was already 88 years old. So you can see just within this space itself, it has been a forerunner in terms of assisting with some social inequity. It started from the Westmoreland Building Society, which, as I mentioned, was founded in 1874. And it's also, one of those institutions that emerged as a leader in the mortgage industry. Actually, it is so astounding to think that a building society is now such a major conglomerate. Now, many of you are not familiar with the term building society. It is a financial institution that provides banking and other financial services to its members. They resemble credit unions, and they're owned by their members. So this is like one of the main characteristics of a building society. So we're all in the same family. So this principle of mutuality has guided the group. And in 1970, after various mergers and acquisitions, the Westmoreland Building Society changed its name to the Jamaican National Building Society. And over the years, it has had a very strong strategy of looking at various industries, expanding its blueprint. And now we have a very strong financial presence. We had to create the Jamaica National Group in 2017 because by this time we recognized that we had to evolve. And with the financial arm, we wanted to enter the commercial space. So we had to do some reorganization of the group itself. So there is the Jamaica National Group, and you have MCS Group, which entails non-financial companies, and the Jane Financial Group itself. In 2017, the group was able to launch a commercial bank, the first mutual commercial bank in Jamaica. And interestingly enough, in 2019, we received approval from the UK government to form a bank in the UK. So just sharing with you, it has been a process of continuous development and innovation, acquiring various companies, upgrading ourselves as well. JN is the first financial institution to be ISO certified in Jamaica. And this puts us within the category of other global commercial banks. So, we've been expanding into remittance, into all areas that you can think of, insurance, and this has expanded the footprint of the group. Just to give you an idea of the span of the companies, there are 12 subsidiaries now under the Jamaica National Group, and they're separated into financial and non-financial entities. And as mentioned before, the business is quite wide, and all of this started out from one small building society. And it just shows you what can be done with this principle of mutuality, which governs the entire group. So all the companies operating under the group are governed under this principle of mutuality. Globally, looking at our membership, we have members in every single continent. And primarily Jamaica has a base of members with around about 700,000+ members. Canada, the United States, and the UK also have a significant membership. And this is because, Jamaicans are represented right across the world. And as a group, we see ourselves positioned to serve our members no matter where they are globally. So it really speaks to a strategic thinking, big thinking about how you can expand your services, not just in your community, but also thinking about reaching members wherever they are and putting the platforms, the services, the processes in place to support that. So what are some of the key learnings that I would have gleaned from the Jamaica National Group? First and foremost, membership matters. This is, a term that, cooperatives use right across the world. What the Jamaica National Group has done through membership engagement is to reinforce its ethos, which is to improve lives, build communities, and unleash the potential of members. It's a people first mentality. And what that means is that we're supposed to make an impact in the communities that we serve. We utilize our members through groups that we call circle groups. And these groups decide on which projects and initiatives that are most relevant to the community, and we act. So we're not just present in the community taking dollars, we're also working with the community to build them as well. And this really reinforces the whole idea of serving our members where they are making and improving their lives. In terms of grant equity, I'd mentioned to you before that, this is an institution that, as we speak, is 148 years old. However, in 2017, with the imminent launch of Genbank, we had to now relook at our identity and how we would move forward into the future. And on the marketing side, we had a number of challenges that we had to overcome because you have a view of how do you see yourself and how does a member view you. But we recognized that we had a rich heritage, being the only Jamaican-owned commercial bank. All the other players are not wholly Jamaican-owned. We're in the communities, people know us. Or main tagline for years has been, "We'll help you find a way." But we had to now help people to understand the process of mutuality and help them to realize that even though we're moving into the commercial banking space, we had no intention of adopting commercial banking principles. At the time, the Jamaican populace thought that the commercial banks were rapacious, they were unreasonable, and that they were not there to support them, only to take their dollars and send them overseas. So we wanted our members to know that this is the bank you own, and this is a message we went out with. We put ourselves forward as Jamaica's #1 member-owned bank. And a lot of people came and they said, "What does that mean? We own the bank." So it really elevated that mutuality concept. One vote, everyone's vote counts. Your voice matters. And it really resonated in the space, gave us a lot of traction on the marketing and advertising side. And this resulted in our reinforcement of ourselves as a dominant player, because even though we were coming in at #3, we were still the #1 mortgage provider in the market. We were the experts there. We had 143 years at the time experience with mortgages, and we were determined to carry our whole mutuality principle into everything that we did. So we wanted to put our people first, our members first, and let them know that we were there to serve them and help them to find a way to their goals. In terms of looking at our members, we had to engage them and think about, how do they view us? And what came out of it was quite surprising as well. They saw us as a people's bank, the bank that is there to serve the small person. They saw us as being down to earth, approachable, someone who is in the space to provide, protect. They saw us as an advocate, a more caring bank. And we wanted to ensure that in our marketing efforts, we represented the little people. We had a real conflict internally, because some persons thought that we're entering the commercial banking space, we need to look like Bank of Nova Scotia. We need to go for those clients. But interestingly enough, we had McKinsey and Company come in and do some consultation with us. And they reinforced to us that you need to focus on your members, focus on your base and grow them. Because the other banking institutions had already cornered the higher to upper level of the economy. So focus on your members. You have a wide member base and help your members to grow. And that's what we did. So in the advertising here, you will see these are actual members we use. This is a member who is a street vendor, and Antoinette Perkins, she's a teacher. We wanted our members to see themselves in the advertising and to know that we were still going to be the same mutual caring organization that they knew. Now, looking into the future, the Jamaica National Group now is operating under 3 strategic pillars: sustainability, digitalization, and people first. As mentioned before, the group had to consolidate operations, reorganize under the Banking Act, and in order to launch the Genbank locally. Genbank UK was launched in 2020, and they're looking now to launch Genbank Cayman, hopefully soon. In terms of our processes, they're looking to automate credit decisions and also to have a single onboarding platform. And just to give you, I'm wrapping up now, just to give you a little insight into the Genbank UK operations. It's the first Caribbean group to launch a bank in the UK. So this is a tremendous achievement for Jamaica and for the group. It's wholly owned by the Jamaica National Group. It's a digital first bank. And this year they were the winner of the British Bank Awards for the best personal loan bank. So when you think back about a small building society in Jamaica, now having a bank in the UK, operating under the same principles of mutuality, this is indeed a big thing. And of course, lastly, just want to mention this element, culture and employee engagement is so important. And the group reached out to its 2,000 employees with a program to reinforce these principles of mutuality, dependability, authenticity, reliability, and transparency, so that we could truly live our mutuality values. And it shows, because in the most recent customer satisfaction survey, overall, they received an 87% customer satisfaction. And just to note that this is down from the previous year, which was 90%. But overall, members believe that their in-branch customer experience was good, and the response to COVID was also very good. So still some work there to do, but it's really a success story, just showing you all that from small beginnings with a futuristic look, that cooperatives, credit unions, mutuals, we can do great things. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I believe that you have got some insight here. And if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to take them at an appropriate time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Candice. I am now going to pass things over to Kevin. We're going to have some questions and answers at the end. Kevin, over to you.
Unmute. So I want to just check one. Can people see a slide deck up on their screens? I see some thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you so much. So I am Kevin, and I am coming to you from the unceded lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in British Columbia. And I'm pleased to be able to join colleagues in Saskatoon and Treaty 6 territories for Co-op Week. And as Bill was explaining, Co-op Month in the United States, where they can even have a bigger celebration. As Marc-Andre gave an introduction to me, I'm a PhD candidate at JSGS in Saskatoon, and I'm very excited to be just getting into the zone of launching out into research, and I'm giving Marc-Andre a little bit of a preview, although he knows a fair bit of it, about what might be coming in the terms of research proposals in the future. In the context of Co-op Week and cooperation in the world of tomorrow, I wanted to take a moment and reflect, one, on my research and my research interests, which is co-ops as policy tools, but also what that might mean in the context of the world of tomorrow. And one, in the context of the territorial acknowledgement and truth and reconciliation, one thing to think about as we move into a Canada that is defined by reconciliation between settlers and the history of colonialism and our Indigenous peoples, is that co-ops and cooperation is sometimes not the alternative in some Indigenous communities to the way that it is in mainstream settler communities. I can remember working in previous roles with groups such as Arctic Co-ops Limited, where I had my paradigms completely reset as I learned about cultural and historical and community approaches to cooperation in Indigenous communities, and how it's a different way of living and a different way of doing things than I might be used to through my lived experience. And as I come to you from British Columbia, where right now I can look out my window to my left and not see the building across the courtyard because of forest fire smoke that is inundating the lower mainland of British Columbia, I think about co-ops as representing a different way of doing economy and economic growth for the future, and ways to respond to a climate that is in crisis, in an environment that is in pain and in suffering because of a lot of what our economic system has done. So when I think about co-ops as policy tools, I also am thinking about the world of tomorrow and in the future, and in the context of truth and reconciliation, in the context of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So that's where I start from. But I want to introduce you to a little bit of the planks of my approach to research and the questions that I'm asking. So first up is an acknowledgement that the co-op community that we are in, that a number of us are members of, that I have proudly worked with and supported, has been built by strong and independent communities that have come before us and that still exist around us. Candice just gave us a deeply inspiring examination of the co-op community that she's been involved with and its impact in her community, but also around the world. And we can make similar observations with cooperatives and co-op communities around us. It's been a culture, a piece of the fabric, the cultural fabric of Saskatchewan in the development of the province and in many of the rural communities around the province, but also in British Columbia and Quebec and all parts of Canada and huge amounts of the world around us, in terms of how communities have come together and built cooperative organizations to support themselves, their goals, and their visions of the world for tomorrow. And when I look at that history and that cultural consolidation and communication, I also think about my lived experience and a perspective I bring from working in government, which is that co-ops are often supported by supportive policy environments. Communities are strong, communities are independent, they build their cooperatives, but they often succeed when governments and public policy is supportive of that way of building organizations and community groups. And that leads me to a question that I think probably resonates with us in a bunch of different ways. My first question is, why are there supportive policy environments for cooperatives in some jurisdictional, some geographic areas and not others? And you can look at this question from another dimension too, in terms of time. Why has there been supportive policy environments for cooperatives at some point in our collective history of building communities and not in others? Why has support ebbed and flowed? And why does it change from one region to another? And if I'm able to gather information that gives insight into that question, it moves me to my next question, which is, what can be done to build supportive policy environments for the future? If we are going to work towards promoting a transition to different forms of economic organization to support truth and reconciliation, or to move in better directions for climate change and the environment, or affordable housing, or any one of the tens and dozens of other policy issues that cooperatives can play a powerful role in, is because they do and demonstrate today. What can we do to build supportive policy environments around us? In my work, I want to tap into existing stores of knowledge that we have in our communities. People on this call who have been involved with building cooperatives and have colleagues that are running and managing and developing cooperatives around them, they know core knowledge about cooperatives. 3 bullet points are on the slide, but there's so many others that are common touch points between cooperative organizations and cooperators and cooperative communities. One is that as economic organizations, cooperatives do business differently. We can look at building societies or cooperative housing or credit unions and financial cooperative institutions, and recognize how the cooperative form of organization puts different priorities at the core of the way that economic institutions and organizations are developed and run. We know that core to that difference is the principles of cooperation. The International Cooperative Alliance has that defining statement that Canada played a large role in contributing to, that really define what makes that difference and anchor it in a vision of a different way of doing business, a different way of organizing communities, and a different way of living together. And those principles help define what the difference is for cooperatives. And on an operational and financial side of the equation, we also know that cooperatives invest in and build communities. Experiences in jurisdictions are different depending on where your history is, but some governments and some policy environments in some parts of the world have used cooperatives as creative ways to do community economic development when other options were not available or were not politically attractive. Power cooperatives, electricity cooperatives across the prairies and across the United States helped build infrastructure to farms and to communities where traditional utility companies would not normally go, as a way that supportive policy environments could help support cooperative development. And then those cooperatives supported the development of other cooperatives, marketing cooperatives, economic cooperatives that built communities. And they invest in communities through that work. This is knowledge that is just second nature to people who are involved in the cooperative community and cooperative economics. It's core to their experience. But is it core to everyone's experience and everyone's knowledge? And that's what drives me to my second question. And it's asking, what do policymakers know? As I mentioned, I have a unique position in my life and in my experience. I work as a policy maker in government. I'm not a political decision maker, but I craft the options the decision makers choose from. And my personal position and my knowledge and experience with cooperatives allows me as an individual person in policy environments to act as a policy entrepreneur and propose the consideration of cooperatives as alternatives. But as Marc-Andre knows, that's not knowledge that's universal across policy makers and policy environments. And really one core question to ask is, what do policymakers actually know about cooperatives? Do they know the principles? Do they know the potential for them to be involved in community development or economic development? And can we contextualize that in the work that they're doing and the problems that they are trying to solve? And then to connect the two sides of that question together, we go back to cooperative communities and co-op leaders and ask, how could cooperators mobilize their knowledge and their lived experience at building different solutions to community problems in the policy world? There's been some research work that's dived into trying to figure out, should cooperatives exist on a policy advocacy level, proposing specific solutions to specific problems, or should they be involved more at a political level, proposing alternative ideas and alternative ways of conceiving of the problems and opportunities we have? Somewhere in there might be knowledge to be gained, and it's what I hope to engage with in my PhD dissertation research in the future. From my research so far, through an adventure of comprehensive examinations and coursework at JSGS, which has been really a life-changing experience, there's hints at contributing factors that we can point to already. Political circumstances seem to be really significant in the opportunity for co-ops to emerge as an option on policy agendas. In Saskatchewan, a large amount of knowledge of cooperatives came from political currents and governments, but that knowledge may have been embedded in political culture afterwards and survived the transition between parties, and it may not have. Political and economic paradigms in multiple governments, in multiple areas, might be actively conspiring to create opportunities and windows where cooperatives can be seen as options. But at the same time, they might also be building walls between the problems that we have and the options that we see and the world of cooperatives and cooperation. If you study the policy and public policy science side of this question, you know that the actors involved in the policy cycle and policy communities, their knowledge of options and alternatives is often crucial to the options that are considered by decision makers. And where that knowledge, its extent, its coverage, and the boundaries of that knowledge may be extremely influential in the opportunity to build environments that support cooperatives, where you could have policies that, even from the context of startup loans in Canada that refuse to recognize cooperatives as a valid business form in the past. Little things like that, those policy levers are things that can help support the development of cooperatives for the world of tomorrow. And finally, tapping into that lived experience. I've been lucky. I've worked in the cooperative sector. I've helped develop cooperatives. My experience has been influenced by people in the sector who are doing this work on a day-to-day basis. But that lived experience sometimes needs some help to be codified, examined, and explained in different ways. Knowledge needs to be translated. And that translation, that bridging between the experience on the ground in the cooperative sector and really the sometimes insular experience of public policy bureaucrats and decision makers needs to potentially be connected. So in the future, I think I've got lots of really interesting opportunities to engage in this kind of research, connecting with policy staff who help understand cooperatives and propose alternatives, decision makers who choose between options and understand the range of alternatives that they can consider, co-op leaders who are doing the work on the ground, and members who live the services and the benefits that cooperatives provide in communities. And importantly, I think it's necessary to study successes. We point and we're proud of successes of where cooperatives have existed, but we also need to understand failures, because sometimes those failures give us insight as to what we need to change to build supportive policy environments in the future. My research is still at this ephemeral crafting proposals and ideas stages, but I wanted to share that insight into where I have gone so far and where I hope to go in the future. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to share those questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. And I hope we have some time for a good conversation to kind of maybe poke on some of that. So let's go to Bill, otherwise known as Natalie in this call. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Marc-Andre, and thanks, Candice, and thanks, Kevin, for your presentations. Very, very interesting. I'm glad to have two of my classmates in the room here, Haley and Jen, and Haley's 9-month-old. So if you hear activity in the background, that's the 9-month-old. So I'm obviously a JSGS PhD student, and I'll be meeting with Marc-Andre and Murray Fulton, who many of you know, later this afternoon, talk more about thesis proposal. But what I'm going to talk about today is agricultural data. And as we move into the increasing digitization of society, agriculture is at the forefront of digitization. 10 years ago, we operated analog farm equipment. Now there's smart devices in almost every piece of equipment that's being produced. And if Stan's running my slides, if we can move to the next slide. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that there's really two aspects where I'm part of a team. It's not just my individual research. And the first is through SSHRC grants to the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. And we received 2 grants, both a knowledge synthesis grant as well as a connections grant. And as you can see, Marc-Andre is an instrumental member of that team, along with Murray Fulton, Professor Yang, and then Stan as well. And we issued a report in August of 2021 on our ag data research, and did a conference in Kamloops earlier this spring. If we can go to the next slide, Stan, please. And then there's a second body of research where I'm participating in, and that's known as the Emily Collaborative. And Emily stands for the Enterprise Machine Intelligence and Learning Initiative. And it's an ag data collaborative being led by the University of Winnipeg, University of Saskatchewan, Marc-Andre, and Natalie, who's on the call. Stan and I are all very involved in that collaborative. And the collaborative is really focusing on ag data ownership issues, contracts, privacy, and security. I'm actually leading the ownership side of that. Going to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about digitizing agriculture, something near and dear to my heart. I still milk cows on weekends when I'm not traveling across mostly the United States, but certainly into Canada as well. And milk for a good friend of mine who milks about 500 dairy cows. And his dairy cows all have ear tags in them with smart devices transmitting information on their temperature, how often they've actually been fed that day. Those types of data is being collected. And you can see here, obviously, we've got a combining wheat, which is pretty predominant here in Saskatchewan. But really any type of farm implement. I've already talked about cattle ear tags, but robotic milkers. as dairy producers in Canada and the United States, because of the shortage of labor, start relying on machines to actually milk cows instead of folks like me who make mistakes. There's just this volume of data that's being collected. But the data is also being collected in processing of agricultural and food products. So when you think of the fruit that's in your grocery store, more often than not now is coming in a container that has smart devices attached to it that are monitoring the amount of time of the fruit was in transportation, what the temperature is of that fruit, all of that. So to help ensure quality and all this data that's being collected. And you can't, well, maybe you can't see me right now. I'm using my arms as I talk about this, but being combined with weather and climate information, land use data. So what does the field look like? How fertile is that field? What kind of precipitation is it received over the growing season? What type of crop protection, have been applied? So ag chemicals. What type of weed conditions through drones as they go across fields. And I actually have a drone that I use for that purpose to look at what kind of weed conditions are, what kind of pests conditions are there in that field. Going to the next slide. And you can see a drone here. That's not my drone. I'll just point out my drone's not quite as expensive as that one, but there's a lot of advantages from digitization of agriculture, and that's to improve seeding practices, really reduce, and this is significant, the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer, because now it's the right chemical in the right place at the right time if you're not an organic farmer. And I work with a lot of organic farmers, but it's really reduced the amount of chemical and fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers that are applied to fields. And it overall improves its management decision-making. Next slide. You can see just some of the companies that are involved in this. Bayer in the upper right corner is thought to own about 53% of the world's agricultural data at this point. That's powerful information that's been collected by Bayer. One of the feeding sources is Bayer acquired Monsanto, and many of you will recognize Monsanto as an ag chem company. And the chief financial officer of Monsanto said only a few years ago, the real value in this company is not in the products that we create and sell to producers, it's in the data we're collecting on our producers. And so so this is what we call big ag data. All this data is being collected, and it gets to the bottom question, and the question that I'm very interested in, both as a lawyer, agricultural lawyer, but as a policymaker. I served for a number of years as the Deputy Agriculture Commissioner in the state of Minnesota, similar position in Wisconsin. You'd call them the minister, but I'm really interested in this from a policy perspective. So who's really getting the monetization value of this data? Next slide. And there's concerns by producers as they're providing this data. They have concerns about privacy. Who's getting access to this data, and how's this data being used in some cases against me? And one of the areas of research that Marc-Andre and the rest of the team and I have found is that hedge funds are really interested in this data because it allows them to use this data to compete against farmers for purchasing farmland, because as the stock market is not doing well and other types of investments, the one type of investments that's doing really well right now is land. And so there's an intense competition with farmers for farmland. Security, certainly having that data out in the world, in the cloud, or if it's on servers, certainly security issues, data ownership. And that's a question that I'm particularly interested in. Who owns this data? Because who owns it helps determine who gets the monetized value of it. Data portability and competition. So when I, as a producer, decide to go to Bayer for my ag chem, and I download the software on my iPhone, and I'm tracking this data from my combine and everything else, if I decide I don't like Bayer products anymore and I want to move to a competitor, does that data go with me? Or does it really lock me in as a Bayer customer? Certainly market power, those that have the data and can aggregate that data have real predictive value. And so that's going to be hugely important, and it is hugely important versus those that don't. And there's a lack of farmer trust. Just going to the next slide, as I go through these slides really quickly, the bottom line from these slides is whether it's in Canada, the United States, Australia, or the European Union, a lot of farmers have concerns from a trust perspective, but who do they trust? They don't necessarily trust Bayer and some of the other companies that I talked about, but they do trust their local farm supply cooperative. And so that is something that we have definitely seen both in the research coming out of the European community, as well as research we've been doing amongst producers here in Saskatchewan. Next slide. And so how has the agriculture community responded? So far, it's been voluntary efforts. You can see there's an effort in the United States, New Zealand, Australia, European community, and then here in Canada, of looking at voluntary data charters, basically, well, data charters. I'm not focusing on the legislation so much in Canada, but on the codes of practice or charters and other, and they're volunteer. And so the companies that subscribe to that volunteer to subscribe to certain practices on privacy and security, on the readability of contracts, those types of things. But there's really no one out there that's ensuring the protection of the farmer interest. Going to the next slide. And so is there a cooperative response to big ag data challenges? And there's a professor out of Columbia University who spent some time looking at this, and there's a quote there: if data producers themselves wish to have a say in ag data, they need to create a collective governance structure. And so she didn't tease out the word cooperative, but that's what's behind her quote. Going to the next slide. So is there a cooperative response? Again, is the question. So who really owns the data? And so agriculture producers, the reality right now, receive little or no compensation for their data that they provide to aggregators. It's the aggregators who are getting that value. Property rights oftentimes don't apply, because when you look at intellectual property, you can't protect the raw data coming off of your farm from a copyright perspective or trademark. And the value of that ag data is primarily, from predictive analytics. And the more data you collected, the more predictive you can be. And so we get into a world where co-ops were formed in response to monopolies, but right now big tech is really monopolizing ag data and sells selective access, again, to hedge funds, to Refinitiv. I met in their boardroom on Wall Street, Canadian-owned company, but their goal is to be the largest depository of ag data, and they want to sell it to everyone else. Going to the next slide. So there are some attempts to wrap cooperatives around the idea of ag data. There's a cooperative farmer-owned out of Texas, Grower Information Services Cooperative, GISC. And what they found is it was really hard to argue, or hard to get farmers together with the idea of creating a database that was going to compete with the Bayers of the world, but that they could do this in a smaller scale. So in Platte River, picture there from Nebraska, where they have combined their data to look at how much water are they pulling out from irrigation, and using that with government to develop better irrigation practices. And so it's on more of a smaller scale, it appears at this point. But it's something that definitely shows some promise. And going back to Kevin's presentation on how do we influence policymakers getting a database so that we can have a positive influence on policymakers. Going to the last slide, I believe it is. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and you've got my contact information if you want to ask more information. And thanks again for the opportunity to present today.
Wonderful, Bill. Thank you. Thank you to all three presenters. Some really thought-provoking content here. We have about 4 minutes for questions and answers. And we can stick around a little bit after 12 for those who want to, but for the recording, I'd like to wrap up by noon. So who wants to throw a question at Candice, Kevin, or Bill? Let's have a little chat. I see a message popping up here. Great job, Bill. You make us proud back in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Okay, yes. He makes us proud too. Honorary Canadian, Bill.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll throw a question on the table. Candice, I'm curious, what is the policy kind of perspective on your mutual bank in Jamaica? Does that come up in your conversations? You mentioned the act change
Yes.
for credit unions and microfinance, but I'm not sure I heard anything about your organization particularly.
Right. Thanks for that question, Professor. So in order to operate in the commercial banking space, the building society had to convert to a mutual commercial bank, so to speak. So typically, building societies are governed under the Cooperatives Act. However, you're restricted in terms of the products and services that you can offer. So with the expanding membership and also the plans for expansion globally, we had to really go through the Bank of Jamaica process of fulfilling all of the regulatory requirements to become a commercial bank. We also had to restructure the group itself, because with those entities, you had financial companies in investment, insurance, etc., and non-financial companies. So the group itself had to be restructured as well to facilitate same. Now with the credit unions, they are not governed under the Banking Act currently. Not regulated by BOJ. However, with the changes that have been put forward to the Banking Act, they will be. So everyone is getting themselves ready with the new requirements and so on. So there are lots of players in the space, and everybody's in preparation. The BOJ has a sandbox, so you have to go through all of the processes and ensure that you have everything in place in order to be governed by them.
Great, thank you, Candice. That's really helpful. And I feel like I could probe a little more. I see any other questions? I see Esther has a question. I just want to make sure I'm inclusive of Kevin and Bill, and our 1 minute left. Anything folks want to ask, and we can come back to Esther's question offline a bit. Anything for Bill or Kevin?
Mark Andre, there's a question in the chat there.
Okay. Is it from Esther?
From Margaret
has a question.
Okay, Bill, are there any parallels to data ownership by patients in the medical field? Okay, so that's the question, I guess, for Bill.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And as Margaret knows, I live about 20 kilometers from Epic, which is the largest holder of patient data in the United States. About 40% of patient data is held by that privately owned company. And I think what we're doing in the ag data space is really a proxy for lots of other types of industries and the data being collected in those industries. And I think this data that's being collected by insurance companies and healthcare providers are eventually going to be used, unless there's policymaker intervention, against us as consumers. And that it's going to be important for us to be able to, through cooperatives and other collaborative structures, to be able to have our own data so that we can basically go to bat or to be able to negotiate with these companies as they try to say, we understand from the data we collect on you that you're this health profile, so we're going to price your insurance. I know that's not quite the same in Canada as it is in the United States. But yeah, it's giving them a lot of data which they can monetize against our interests.
Right. Oh, that's great. Thanks, Bill. I'll throw one to Kevin just because we're going to have to wrap up, and I want to distribute the questions equitably. So, Kevin, I just want to play off something Candice said about all these financial institutions coming in under one act, and I'm kind of curious if you have any reflections on this idea of pulling all sorts of organizations in one centralized legislation. So in this case, the Bank Act, which presumably was made for banks. What is your thought on that? Just off the cuff, this idea of putting cooperatives in legislation that was not meant necessarily for cooperatives.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Mark Andre, and you can approach it from a couple of different angles, like the enabling side of things, in that cooperatives need a place legally to be incorporated, so that way they can exist. It's important. You can't open a bank account without being able to do that, or a credit union account, as we would hope that co-ops would do. But at the same time, what you can see in certain circumstances is that the legislation can sometimes form a framework in which organizations learn to understand their existence and how they operate. So customized legislation, a credit union act instead of a bank act, might allow to put intention and purpose behind the way that organizations are built. you see that in Canada as well. Some provinces have specific types of legislation for specific types of cooperatives, worker co-ops, agricultural co-ops, housing cooperatives, and that sometimes helps define them a little bit. Flip side of that is that where you have a one-size-fits-all co-op act is where you can do a lot of really innovative crossing of boundaries, but that still is different from like a Business Corporations Act that allows a cooperative form under the Business Act. So there's multiple ways of looking at it from legal perspectives, but I think it does come down to intent, framing, and understanding.
Yeah, great answer. And it's a long-standing issue within the cooperative sector. I think something we can revisit in your thesis a little bit. So folks, I'm going to wrap up. For those who want to stay around, we can kind of dig in a little bit more, but I'll just offer some concluding remarks. First of all, thank you to Kevin and Candice and Bill so much. There's a lot here and a lot more we could talk about. Just a little shout out to the center. You know, all these questions are really questions, all these projects that we've been talking about today are on our plate. We are talking about ag data co-ops. We're talking about legislation and co-ops. I'm personally very vested in banking and co-ops. We have major projects around healthcare co-ops in Saskatchewan. There's a lot going on here. If you're interested in the way policy connects with the real world, I'd invite you to reach out to us and see what we can do together. So that's a little plug. One more little plug. We have our next co-op conversation, which is always the first Wednesday of every month. That's happening on November 2nd. And we're going to have Tian Wan of the Cooperative Development Foundation of Canada speaking to us. Cooperative Development Foundation of Canada does co-op development all over the world, and they have a really cool community-based and locally led approach to co-op development. I think if you're interested in the kind of transformative potential of cooperatives, this is the talk you're going to want to be part of. So with that, I thank you all for your kind attention. Really look forward to engaging with you in the future, and have a great rest of your day.